Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our MPC online Bible study. My name is Matthew McGlade. I'm the lead and teaching pastor here at Mansfield Pentecostal Church, where every Tuesday night we have a thought to think about, a question to ponder, and a text to study. And we're continuing our Bible study series titled The Kingdom Story. And you remember we're looking at the grand narrative, the grand story of the Bible, all the way from Genesis to Revelation and all 66 books. And you remember that the main theme that I believe that the story of the Bible is about the kingdom of heaven. And where we're doing this in 7 parts. We looked at the first part, the kingdom's expression, where we saw God's kingdom revealed in creation. And then we looked at part 2, the kingdom's rebellion, where man rebels against God and man tries to be king. And then we looked at the kingdom's salvage plan from Genesis 5 to the rest of the Genesis, where we looked at how God reveals how he's going to restore humanity through the flowless flood and through the faith of Abraham. And then the last part, we were looking at the kingdom's instrument, and we looked at how God was using the nation of Israel to reveal his purpose and his plan to the nations of the earth, what it was like to live under God's rule and reign. And then last week, you remember, we moved on to part 5, and we're starting to look at that part of the Bible that reveals of the kingdom's rejection. And we saw that the nation of Israel, who had it all, they had everything given to them, threw it all away. And the people of Israel started to reject God for what he had given them. So after the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt, he brought them to Mount Sinai. He revealed to them his law and his covenants. And God said that if you live by my law, you'll be the most blessed nation on earth. You'll be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. God says, I'm going to bring you into the promised land to give you an inheritance. And we saw that after Moses brought the covenant to the Israelites and they agreed to live by God's covenant, that no sooner had they were agreeing to live by God's ways, that they were breaking God's ways. And last week we saw they made themselves a golden idol, a golden calf, in rebellion to God. And then when God was bringing them to the edge of the promised land, they refused to believe in God's promise. And so they rejected God in the wilderness. So they spent a whole 40 years wandering in the wilderness. And then when they came into the land of Canaan, no sooner had they occupied the land than they were engaging in the practices of the people who were there, whom God told them to destroy, and they didn't. And they were soon engaging in idolatry and sacrificing the children to false idols. And then the final rejection was that they rejected God as their king, and they wanted to have a king rule over them, a human king, instead of having God as their king. And that's what we picked up from last week, is that God gave them their first king, Saul. And unfortunately, Saul did not serve God wholeheartedly, and Saul rejected God, and so God rejected Saul as king, and that's where we looked at last week. And so what we're going to be doing tonight is that we're going to continue this theme of how this nation that had everything given to them continued to reject God and continued to walk away from God. And so God decided, after Saul was rejected as their king, God decided to appoint for him another king. And this time, God appointed them a man after his own heart, who would complete everything that he wanted them to do. And that, as we know, was King David. And because David was a man who loved God, God promised to establish his throne and give him a throne that will last forever over Israel. And it was through David that God promised that one of your descendants would have a throne that will last forever, and that through David, the promised deliverer would come. If you remember going right back to the series of teaching, that God said that the promised deliverer would come through the seed of the woman, and then it was through Abraham's descendants. But now we see very specifically that it would be through David that God's promise would come to deliver humanity from its sin and from its brokenness. Well, David, as I mentioned, was a man after God's own heart, and he loved God, but he wanted to build a house for God. Up until this time, remember a couple of weeks ago, we saw that the presence of God dwelt in a tent, what we call the tabernacle. But David had in his heart to build a house for God, a temple for God, where God will make his presence known in the city of Jerusalem. But God said to David, David, you're not the man who is to build me a house, because you are a man of war, you have blood in your hands. But your son Solomon, who is a man of peace, he'll be the person whom I will appoint to build the temple unto my name. And so after David died, Solomon came to power, and Solomon built this temple unto the Lord. Now I find it really interesting that when Solomon came to power, the first thing that he asked of God was that you would give me wisdom to know how to lead this people. And on 3 separate occasions, God revealed himself personally to Solomon, and he asked Solomon, what do you want me to give you? And Solomon asked, give me wisdom that I may know how to lead and to govern this people. And God was glad that Solomon asked for this, and God gave him the wisdom that he needed. And so Solomon built this temple unto the Lord. But on one occasion when God visited Solomon, God said to Solomon, you know what, if you reject me, like one of your predecessors did, and if the nation of Israel continues to reject me, as many of them were doing at that time, then God says, I'll reject you, and I'll reject you as I'll reject the nation of Israel, and this temple that you have built that is looking grand will be destroyed, and then the Israelite people will go into exile and they'll lose the land that I have given them. Well, Solomon unfortunately went the same way as the nation of Israel had done previously. And remember, we said that the heart of the issue is the issue of the heart, because the heart still remained unchanged. Solomon had this crazy idea of marrying up to over 300 wives. I don't know what he was thinking, but that's what he decided to do. And the problem was that his wives turned his heart away from God, from his pure devotion to God. And some of the wives that he married were wives of foreign nations who also had idols and worshipped false gods. And tragically, Solomon, who built the temple of God, was worshipping these false Canaanite gods like Moloch and the Ashtoreths, and making sacrifices to these horrendous gods. And so God decided that he was going to remove the kingdom away from Solomon's descendants. But it presented God with a problem, because God promised to David, his father, that he would always have a throne and then always have someone to be seated on the throne of David. And so after Solomon's death, God decided to split the kingdom of Israel in two. He was going to give 10 of the 12 tribes to one other person, and 2 of the remaining tribes of the 12 tribes to David's descendants. And so after Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam came to power. Rehoboam, unfortunately, was a little bit arrogant. And when the Israelites came to Rehoboam and they asked him, would you please ease the burden that was put on us by your father? Rehoboam answered arrogantly. And he says, no, I will not do that. And the result of that, 10 of the tribes of Israel decided to reject the house of David. And said, we no longer want to be under the house of David, the house of Jesse. And so they set up their own kingdom, those 10 tribes, what we know now as the northern kingdom of Israel. And they appointed a man by the name of Jeroboam to be the king of the northern kingdom of Israel. The capital of the northern kingdom of Israel was a place called Samaria. However, the southern kingdom of Judah, that is the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, were allocated to the house of David, and they would forever belong to the line of David. And so we see that this kingdom was now split in two. Well, no sooner had Jeroboam come to power that he was quite insecure as a leader. And he was a bit insecure by the fact that many of the Israelites were still going to Jerusalem to worship God at the temple. And so what Jeroboam did is that he set up 2 idols in the north and the south of the northern kingdom of Israel. And he told the Israelites that you are to worship these gods and not the Lord at the temple. And he was advocating that these were the gods who brought you out of Egypt. And so he led the nation, the northern kingdom of Israel, into terrible idolatry. He led them away in their relationship with God. And sadly, for the next 19 succession of kings of the northern kingdom of Israel, with 9 different dynasties, each of those kings followed the example of Jeroboam. They didn't walk faithfully after God. They rejected God. And during this time, the Lord will send prophets like Hosea and Amos to his people, telling them, you need to turn back to God. You need to repent. Otherwise, you're going to go into exile. Otherwise, you're going to lose the land. But the Israelites would not listen to God. And as a result of that, about 700 years before the birth of Christ, an empire known as the Assyrian Empire invaded the land, the northern kingdom of Israel, and they took the Israelites and the 10 tribes into exile. And so we see a real tragic end. God did what he said he would do if the Israelites would reject them. And so many of these tribal peoples were scattered all across the known world. Now, sometimes this raises the question, are there any lost tribes of Israel? And the answer to that question is no, they're not, because God knows exactly where each of his tribes are. Interestingly enough, in the 1980s, the Israeli government issued a special operation to bring people of North African origin back to Israel, who were shown to have a genetic link to one of the tribes of Israel, and they were Israelite by all accounts. They had stories passed on to them of the temple in Jerusalem, and it's an incredible story. And so there are still people groups all across the world that can trace their heritage back to the ancient kingdom of northern Israel. But sadly, the northern kingdom of Israel went into exile because they continued to reject God. Well, the same outcome also happened to the southern kingdom of Judah. Remember, the southern kingdom of Judah were the descendants of David. And throughout, because generally the kings of that dynasty were more faithful to God, they lasted a bit longer. There were some good kings like Hezekiah and Jehoshaphat and Josiah. They were faithful kings. But there were also some very bad kings like Manasseh who walked away from God. And again, like the northern kingdom of Israel, God sent prophets to his people to warn them to come back to God. One of them was Isaiah and various other prophets. But eventually a point came where the nation of Judah was going exactly the same way as the northern kingdom of Israel. They were being faithful to God. And so God sent them also into exile. This time, another empire came to the fore, not the Assyrians, but this time it was the Babylonians. And this was about 500 years before the birth of Christ. And the Babylonians took the people of Judah into exile to Babylon in 3 separate exiles. And so what we see here, and during this time, there was a prophet by the name of Jeremiah, and he was pleading to the people of Judah to repent and turn back to God. Even at the last hour, there was still an opportunity for them not to go into exile if they turned to the Lord. But sadly, the people of Judah refused to listen to God, and they rejected God, and as a consequence, they went into exile. Now, I just want you to notice just how tragic this was, because the city of Jerusalem, as a result of this, was destroyed by the Babylonians. And just as God had said, the temple that Solomon had built was completely destroyed by the Babylonians. Everything that God warned Solomon would happen did happen, because the nation of Israel and the nation of Judah continued to reject God. A nation that had everything from the glory days of Solomon's rule had now lost everything. They had lost their land. They were in a foreign nation. They lost their temple, and they were now dejected from the time that from the glory days of Solomon now to a place of shame. But I want to suggest to you that even in the midst of all this tragedy for the Jewish people, there was still a glimmer of hope. Though God warned Israel, and particularly the people of Judah, that if they continued in this path, they would go into exile, through the prophet Jeremiah, God said that they would be in exile for up to 70 years in the land of Babylon. And that is exactly what happened. The people of Judah were in exile in Babylon for 70 years. During that time, a new empire came to power. It was no longer the Babylonians, but it was now the Persians and the Medes. And the king of the Persians and the Medes, a man by the name of King Cyrus, exactly 70 years to the day that Jeremiah prophesied that they would be in exile, he issued a decree that the temple of God should be rebuilt in Jerusalem. And for 3 returns, the Jewish people now returned back to the homeland to rebuild the nation that had been destroyed. First, a man by the name of Zerubbabel, he came back to Jerusalem and he rebuilt the temple. And then Ezra, and he came back to teach God's people the ways of God. And then there was another group of exiles who returned back to Judah and Jerusalem. That was Nehemiah. And his priority was to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And so there's a gradual restoration of the Jewish people. But the promised seed, the promised Messiah that God promised, who had come through David, had still not arrived. But it's important to understand that at this time, the Jewish people had been so traumatized by the events of the past and what had happened. You know, the Bible says that when the temple was being rebuilt, that many of the older generation wept because they could remember the glory of the former temple that was destroyed. And so the Jewish people decided that they will never go back to worshiping the idols that their fathers, their ancestors had before. They will never go back to that. But in their zeal, as it were, not to go back to that, they decided to add things to God's law that God had never spoken. And as a result, they started to grow cold in their relationship with God. They started to add formalities and man-made religions and laws to the law of God, and they exalted their interpretation of God's law above the law of God itself. And as a result, they started to become proud in their walk with God. And so their hearts actually became cold in their relationship with God. They made an idol of their understanding of God's law rather than actually trusting in the revelation of God's law and His word. And so they were growing, and so they had a religion. They had a religion, but not a relationship. It was like they were in a marriage with God, but there was no love in that marriage. And so the Lord sent prophets to His people, prophets like Zechariah and Haggai. But the last prophet that God sent to them was the prophet Malachi. And when God speaks to the prophet Malachi, it's all in prose. It's not in poetry. It's not in the language of love. It's almost like the love has gone out of that relationship because the Jewish people were treating their relationship with God as more of a formality than actually as a joy. And sadly, for the next 400 years, God stopped speaking to His people. And so just as the Israelites were 400 years in slavery in Egypt, so for the next 400 years, the Jewish people would be in spiritual darkness in their relationship towards God. Now, what happened during those 400 years? Well, during those 400 years, amongst the Jewish people, some religious groups started to develop. Some of the Sadducees, they had a very strict interpretation of the law of God. The Sadducees were a little bit more liberal in their interpretation of God's law. They didn't believe in the existence of angels or the resurrection of the dead. But nevertheless, what they had was just a religion, a cold, dry, dead religion, not a relationship with God. During this time, there were major changes in the world at this time. You remember the main empires of the age were the Assyrians. They took the Israelites into exile. Then it was the Babylonians. Then it was the Persians and the Medes. But soon there was a new power that came to the fore, the Greek Empire with Alexander the Great. And he destroyed and conquered the Persian Empire. And soon the Jewish people found themselves under the control and the influence of the Greek world. And so they were made to speak the Greek language. Alexander the Great died very quickly, and his kingdom was split into 4 separate kingdoms. And the Jewish people found themselves in between 2 of these kingdoms, to the north and the south. But it wasn't long before a new empire started to rise from the west, the Roman Empire. And before long, Rome started to take control of the province of the Middle East. and they annexed the Jewish people as part of their empire, and they called their land the land of Judea. And so we see that a number of things are starting to change in the world at this time. The world is speaking a common language, the Greek language. But along with that, the Romans have also built a network of roads all across the empire. And so something is being primed, something is being ready for the next part of this story. And so we see that throughout the history of the Jewish people and the history of Israel over these many years, this people who had everything had lost everything. They are now living under a foreign occupying power over their land. They had rejected God. But because they had rejected God, it would become something of the means of salvation for all of the rest of humanity. Up to now, there's a sea of humanity out there that are yet far and distant from God. And here's the amazing thing about what had happened. Before the way of salvation could come to the rest of the world, there is one more rejection that God has to undergo from the Jewish leaders and the Jewish people. God was rejected in the desert, then he was rejected as their king. But this rejection that God is about to experience is the worst rejection known in the history of the human race. And yet, this rejection was so important because without it, none of us here will be in a position to enter God's kingdom. It was a rejection that was to be fulfillment of all that God had spoken of in the pages of the Old Testament. From the blood of the sacrifices of the innocent lamb to the words of the prophets, it was a rejection that would involve his promised seed, the person who was born of the woman of Abraham, the descendant of David. History is about to meet its most important climax. The scene is set for the promised deliverer to step into the world. Who is the seed of the woman? Who is the one who had come through Abraham? Who is the one of the line of David? Yet this promised one is to have his heel bruised, and yet he will also crush the head of Satan, and he will restore the kingdom of God and be the means of salvation to all who put their trust in this person. Who is he? Who is the one? Well, next week, we're going to see who this person is as we move on to part 6 of the kingdom story, and we're going to be looking at the kingdom's king. Well, guys, that's our thought to think about tonight. I trust that you've got something out of that as we've looked at that broad history of the nation of Israel. But the question to ponder tonight is this: What do you think? The outcome of our lives will be if we continue to reject God? So, what do you think will the outcome of our lives be if we continue to reject God? And our text of study, I'd like you to read Romans chapter 11. It's quite a lengthy chapter. Read Romans chapter 11. What did Israel's rejection of God mean for the world? And in the light of this, how should Gentile believers respond to the Jewish people? Guys, thanks for listening tonight. Trust that you got something out of that. Hey, listen, have a great rest of the evening, and looking forward to seeing you over the weekend. God bless you all.